Welcome to Journals of Self-Discovery. Hello everyone, and welcome to this month's edition of Journals of Spiritual Discovery. I just want to note that episode 10, the interview with Mike Schneider, I changed the title on that episode. It's now called Wisdom from Down Home with the Hillbilly Sutra. It's definitely a classic, and if you haven't heard Mike, do listen to that one. I really recommend it. As for this month, I've got Jan Frazier, and I really enjoy the interview with Jan. Although she's spoken at several TAP Foundation meetings, I've never had the opportunity to hear her speak. And it was great just to hear about her background, to hear some of the common experiences that we've had, although we express them in different language, and just to get some of her insights into common hang-ups that seekers have on the path. Do make sure that you check out the show notes. If you're not familiar with those, go to spiritualteachers.org/podcast, and you'll see that for every episode, there's actually a page devoted to it, and it'll have some notes from the show, as well as links to things, for example, like Jan's books, and she mentions the book by Sam Harris in the interview. I have a link to that as well. So that's all I have for this month. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I will speak with you again next month. Well, first thing, Jan, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to do this with me. I really appreciate it. Great. I generally like to start with just a little bit of a person's background, just in case listeners aren't familiar with your story. I know some people, they don't want to talk about the story. They feel like it doesn't matter at all. And we can certainly abbreviate it if you want to. But one of the things I'm always curious about with people is for example, in my life, I really didn't get interested in the spiritual questions until my early 20s, and I just lived a pretty normal, if you will, teenage years and before that. And so I'm always curious if there's a point of time that you can identify that you first had a spiritual inkling or spiritual questions come up for you.
Yeah, it's something that looks different to me over time as time has gone on, and I look back and reconsider that very kind of question. I was raised Catholic, and it meant a lot to me when I was a kid. And so I would say I was aware as a child of feeling a sensitivity to something bigger, or an awareness that there was something, actually it felt physically large, or you could say spatially large, beyond any kind of immediacy. And of course I couldn't have given words to that when I was a child. But there was something about the Catholic practice, the Latin, which it was then, the sacraments, the incense, the majesty of it, and the symbolism that was everywhere, that did seem to register in the kid that I was. Later, when I began to more consciously become interested in what we call the spiritual life. And at that point, I guess I was, in my mid to late 30s. I had stopped being a practicing Catholic long before, like maybe when I was in my late teens. I'd always had the sense that there was a God, let's say, but I didn't have any kind of practice or path or pursuit until I was approaching 40, I guess, maybe in my 30s. And there, I think what precipitated what I could say was a kind of a beginning was I'd had a medical situation that caused me to feel an enormous amount of fear on repeating occasions. and I could feel what a toll it was taking on me. Around that same time, I came upon a spiritual teacher, a guru, through a friend, and it would have been the last thing I ever would have imagined being drawn to, the very last. But in spite of whatever my natural tendencies might have been, I was drawn there, and I think I realized even then that it had something to do with wanting to address the crippling fear and some sense that maybe I didn't have to be subject to all of that, but I, again, I couldn't have articulated this at the time. And so I ended up practicing that spiritual tradition, that practice, for some years. And I guess you could say at that point it sure looked like I was on a path. But that said, I never said in so many words to myself, awakening would be the desired outcome of this, or even a longed for outcome, frankly because I didn't think it was possible. And I think that's partly because I so revered and even, you might say, worshipped my teacher and what I imagined to be her so-called state, that I thought what she was experiencing was unique and particular to her and people like her, but that it didn't happen to ordinary people.
Mm-hmm.
And so when things dramatically changed on my interior, I was taken quite by surprise, and in fact I didn't even understand what had happened for the better part of a year. I didn't relate it to what I had sensed in my teacher. It's kind of strange to me now, but because this is so much in the culture now, at least in a certain part of the Western culture, but I hadn't read books, except for my teacher's books. So, I was a real innocent in a way, and I actually enormously appreciate that now, because I discovered what it felt like to be free of the mind and free of fear and all the rest of it, really from the inside, very much experientially. And I didn't have any language for it. I didn't have any framework. I hadn't been subject to what so many people that I sit with now seem to be subject to, which is being what I would consider limited by a set of ideas and a desperate desire to become free of pain. So I feel fortunate that it wasn't like that for me.
Mm-hmm. Did you, in regards to your teacher at that time, the feeling that awakening wasn't something that you could accomplish, that it was for these rare individuals, was that something that was in the teachings or just in your mind?
It was in my mind.
Yeah.
In fact, my teacher said many, many times, this that you sense in me is everyone's nature. So it's not like she wasn't trying to, but it really was very much in my mind's understanding of what it was like to be both, you could say, enlightened and in a human body. And I had an idea about it that didn't line up with reality.
Mm-hmm. I had something similar for a period of time with a very dynamic teacher, Richard Rose, who you probably know the name, who just seemed he was so intense and so determined, and I thought, oh, this is some sort of Olympian. I can never be like this guy. And that's despite him saying that, of course you can do this.
Yeah.
Similar thing, just in my head, I had this barrier that I couldn't do this.
And did you at some point, did that soften that impression that you had?
It did eventually, and I think what helped me is meeting other teachers. He was my primary teacher for a long time, and while I read books from other traditions, I still didn't get that sense of, the ordinary person who comes upon this. They still seemed like heroes almost. These were heroic people who achieved awakening.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really common to think, and in fact, maybe that's why when some of these teachers who probably really do embody real wisdom and truth turn out to also be human and flawed, that can be devastating to people. And it speaks more of, not of the teachers being a fake or something necessarily, but to me it speaks more of, as what happened to me, the person, the so-called seeker's mindset or orientation to what they observe. And in fact, my wanting to avoid this whole thing, when I've been in the presence of people who've invited me to give a talk or sit with them or something, my inclination has been to, initially it was, to downplay, to do whatever I might do to quiet or to subdue in some way you might say, the energy that might cause the other person to think, oh no, she's really different or better, or this isn't something that I could experience. And I eventually realized that maybe that wasn't such a good thing to be doing that, but it's a trade-off, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, were you, when you were with your teacher, we're speaking of Gurumayi, correct?
Yes.
Were you didn't have the idea of awakening necessarily as something that you were after, but you were trying to reduce fear or be more at ease in life? Was that more what you were aiming for?
Yeah. I wanted to suffer less.
Mm-hmm.
I really did have the sense, and part of what I so appreciated about what I learned from hers is that it invited me to look inside to see what I was doing with reality as it came along that caused me to suffer. So that fundamental thing it really did bear fruit, and I could feel the suffering easing. Excuse me. And it's just that I wanted to behave better. I was a mother of young children at the time, and I wanted to function. I wanted to be a better mother. I didn't want to lose my temper with them. So for me, it all had to do with trying to correct my interior by noticing the extent to which I brought about my own angst, and then that would result in, being more fully present and patient with my children, but also not reacting so painfully when one of these scary experiences happened, or something to do with death or the threat of death.
Mm-hmm. So I'm guessing that you made progress with that over time, or else you wouldn't have kept going with those teachings. Is it?
Yeah.
I guess I'm approaching what was the difference between what you stumbled upon or happened to you in terms of fear falling away and what you had done up to that point.
Yeah. The more I look at that and ask myself that question, the greater the mystery becomes, the more I see that I really can't know. But my sense is that somewhere in me, and I think this happens with most of us, very deep change was occurring that was really unconscious. So you might have said my outer focus was on suffering less, but I think deeply what was going on was that the sense of actual choice, and I mean the very deep choice, like to identify with the person I appeared to be, or that I could be deliberately, however unconsciously, choosing to believe in the truth of certain unexamined beliefs I had, including what was possible and what was not for me, for anybody. So what I think happened was, while I was focusing on trying to suffer less and trying to be a better mother and that sort of behavioral thing, I think the very deep structure of assumptions that I had carried, including perhaps the one that my teacher was, on the approaching unique, not unique, but, had something I didn't have. I think those things were being shaken up, but I was not aware they were being shaken up. And so I used to believe, and I expressed this in the first book I wrote, that it was when I said, or you could say because I said to myself, to whatever, couldn't I go through this medical procedure tomorrow without being afraid? And then I felt it just go right then. I used to think there was a causal relationship there. I now suspect, but again I can't know, that the reason I articulated that question or that prayer the way I did when I did was that something unconscious in me had deeply registered that there was a choice. There always had been a choice. I couldn't have lived it until right then, maybe, but there's something about saying that wish, that earnest, heartfelt wish, that was just saying, in order to hear myself say it, the thing that I had deeply come to realize. And I think that happens a lot with people. By the time we have framed the right question for ourselves, as it were, or the right mental understanding, it might look like we're opening a door to some new knowledge, but what I think is we already know the answer, or I think the mind is sluggish in its articulation of the framing of a problem or a realization.
And you mean at some gut level or intuitive level, we have a sense of what that answer is?
I think the answer is already there, and so then we frame the question to ourselves as a way of giving word or concept to it. And I think how all of that goes on, I suspect, is just from ordinary, daily, momentary life beating us up, shaking up our sense of self over and over again. And, meanwhile, we're going through it thinking we know what we want, including spiritually, thinking we know what we need or what progress is. And I think mostly we have no idea. But meanwhile, life in its, what I perceive as kindness, is pushing us and pulling the rug out from under us and directing our attention in one direction or another, so that very deep learning that we're mostly not conscious of can occur in an ongoing way. And I think that's probably what happened to me. Sometimes I look back now on my youth, or on things that happened long before I met Gurumayi, or thought of myself as, trying to look at my inner work and all that. I sometimes look back on things that happened when I was younger, and I see a significance to them that I never saw before, and I realize, something was going on there. Maybe.
Do you think that it matters for the individual to try to bring those unconscious, subconscious teachings, if you will, to the surface and be aware of them? For example, at the end of each day, thinking back upon the things that happened during the day and trying to see if there were any lessons there.
I think it's certainly good to be open and receptive to a noticing like that. But I really mean that, to notice when it feels like change is happening, but maybe you can't account for it, or to allow yourself to linger in the feeling of that, but to specifically go looking for a thing you could frame conceptually or in words. I think chances are good that's not going to yield much, but I do think the things come to us all on their own and register consciously when we're ready to process them on that level. I think sometimes, and I watch this with so many people, that they think they know what they need to be doing spiritually speaking, but meanwhile, off to the side, I can observe, because they're sharing bits of their lives with me, I can observe things happening that I realize they don't even see the significance of. So sometimes, there's a way in which I sometimes think I can be useful to somebody and say, have you noticed that you laugh more than you used to?
Mm-hmm.
Or, something. So I think we don't always pay attention to indication, like maybe you're sleeping better. So I think it is very good to be attuned to oneself, as often as it occurs to you to say, oh, what is it feeling like to be me nowadays, but not in a critical way, or not in a way that's looking for a harvest to reap. It's more like it's already happening, whatever it is, and to notice and appreciate and allow yourself to linger in the feel of something that might be different from what it was before.
Mm-hmm.
Without taking the next step and saying, oh good, I'm making progress. I wonder if this means I'm about to wake up.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll probably notice in my questions there's going to be a bias towards always trying to turn things into, oh, well, what could I do to amplify that? What could I do to practice that? What could I do? Always trying to accelerate. If there is some sort of natural process going on there, trying to figure out how can it be accelerated.
Yeah. And for me, the really useful thing to do if a person notices that tendency is to just pause and say, what is it in me where is that tendency coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question.
And that can bear fruit. That is a very fruitful place to put the attention. But where the attention usually goes is trying to come up with an answer to the question, as if the question were legitimate.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that the primary environment in which so-called real progress is actually made is in not knowing. It's in not assuming we can understand or take hold of, or it's in a receptivity. There's a recognition that something bigger is going on than whatever I think I understand of it, and that the very opposite of effort and vigilance and all that is, it seems to me, the fertile ground.
Yeah, that reminds me of Richard Rose used to say, backing away from untruth was a way, and to me that's kind of similar to what you're saying. It's not postulating, it's seeing that, that's my mind, that's dreaming, that's make-believe, but not knowing necessarily what isn't, just sort of turning away from what's less true and backing into something unimaginable.
Yeah. And a lot of it, our reluctance to do that very thing that you described so well is we're afraid of the unknown. We want security, we want safety, we want to think, we want to be with the known or the familiar, and it's just not the way it goes. So even to see, it's a natural human tendency to go the other way. It's our pattern. It's what our minds are built for. So it's very natural for a human being to go about it in an effort-laden way. And so just to, if that's going on and I recognize it, oh, that's what that is, that's coming from my mind. Just to see it for what it is does itself bring about a softening, which is really different from trying not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because we do it, and it's already happening by the time we notice it. So it's a way of aligning awareness with the present, because the present right now at such a moment is, I am in this energy of seeking and trying and grasping. And you know, so many people, when they see that, they begin to judge themselves, or they try to stop it, and then that takes us out of the present, because then we're trying to live in the future moment. 2 seconds from now, when the thing might have stopped, or when we'll stop doing it altogether, and that doesn't get us anywhere.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, I listened to a couple of recorded talks of yours, and one thing that you mentioned is that intensity of attention leads to suspension of time. And I think you might, in that talk, have given some examples of like a rock climber, for example, or people doing really intense activities. Is that something that, again, going back to, doing or practicing, is that something that you think has potentially some benefit of just really paying attention to whatever is going on and trying not to let the mind drift and wander and daydream?
For sure. But, whether we're doing some, an intense kind of activity like racing a car or just walking down the stairs. But again, I don't think a person could get up in the morning and say, I'm going to try to pay really close attention to each moment today as I'm in it. And, sometimes attention will be being paid, and sometimes the mind gets busy and we don't know what we're doing right now. And, somebody might say, and I don't know whether this is part of what you were just looking at, whether we might actually deliberately undertake activities that are likely to require a lot of attention or to quiet the mind, like gardening, or, it's often something dangerous, but gardening isn't dangerous, or fishing. And my sense of that is it's the wrong reason to do a thing. If I'm moved to go fishing because I really love to fish, say, then I should go fishing because I love to fish. But I might, naturally become aware while I'm standing at the water's edge with a pole in my hand watching the ripples. I might become aware that, oh, my mind is very quiet here. And part of the reason people love to do those things, or to knit, or they're not necessarily conscious of this, but part of why often we enjoy those things is because they give our minds a rest and we're really in the moment. So we are drawn to do those things. I think that's why people do things like climb mountains, because they love the way it makes them feel.
Do you think that there is a difference then between someone who's knitting, let's say, but has no context for it other than I enjoy knitting, and someone who, let's say, has read your book or listened to one of your talks and likes to knit, and then begins to notice while they are knitting that, they notice qualities of the experience while they're knitting that they wouldn't otherwise have noticed?
I do think that could be the case, the latter, but also if that, I wouldn't ever say to somebody, if you're turning this into a reason, a method, to do something, I would not encourage that. But I think it is true that having encountered the idea of it in a book or hearing somebody talk about it can cause us to become more noticing and indeed appreciative of those moments of real presence. we might not otherwise have it recognized for what they are, and let ourselves feel the pleasure of them.
Yeah. I like
So
this
it's
conversation,
a difference between,
because I'm always trying to turn everything into a method, and you're like, no.
yeah. Well, and it's natural. Of course people want a method.
Right.
I mean, and it's real good to see where that comes from. If it really is true, like, what if it actually is true that everybody already is this, and yet they just don't notice it? Well, let's just supposing it's the case, then it's just a matter of things needing to get out of the way so that we become aware of what's already going on. The idea of a method, a process, progress, does not invite us into the discovery of what's already here. It's looking for change. And that's a waste. It's just not going to get us anywhere. So even people who undertake earnest practice and they look for methods and all that, and they do it for years, and then they finally actually wake up, even they often will say, oh my God, I see now this was always right in front of my face, and I was doing all that wheel spinning, and I needn't have.
Yeah. Yet, right.
But we don't know what to do. If it doesn't feel like it's right in your face, then you say, yeah. So it's natural. But at some point, one thing I gently encourage people to do is, if they have a teacher or a book or a practice or whatever, just to hold it lightly and to realize that, yes, it may do its good. It may appear to move you along and open things and help you let go of one thing and another. But please realize that at some point you're going to feel that it's no longer needed, useful, because anything that truly could be useful is only delivering you to whatever's beyond it. So I encourage people to trust themselves. Like, somebody will say to me, do you think I should meditate? And I say, if when you sit for meditation, you love the way you feel there, if you feel like something happens and you're peaceful in your mind, whatever, then of course you should do it. But the point is to trust yourself. So even if what I might call a method is, clearly, ultimately not going to take you home to yourself, if anybody feels the sense that it's making something significant happen within themselves, and all that is making the blocks soften, making the barriers, lose solidity. And we often wouldn't be able to articulate that to ourselves. I certainly couldn't have. But, if you feel something real happening in you, trust it. And don't hold on to it. And don't think, oh, this is going to take me all the way.
Yeah.
And if it stops feeling fruitful, trust that. We have everything inside of ourselves to the ability to register. Does this feel alive? Or is it that this thing that I'm doing puts me in my head and makes me feel like a failure or like I'm making progress? We can trust if we're willing to look, the impression we get of whatever the phenomenon is. We're always looking for answers outside, as I did.
In regards to negative emotions, if you will, or negative reactions to things of, I'm feeling lousy today, I'm disappointed in myself, all those sorts of things. Do you have any advice for people who, berate themselves about their failures and so forth, or just how to handle the negative things in general? Do you ignore them? Do you look at them? Do you just let them happen? What are your thoughts on that?
My sense is that when a person becomes aware of something like that happening right now, not as a pattern, not when you were a kid, but right now, allow the feeling of it. Do not try to push it away. And if you're judging yourself for it or trying to change it or avoid it, see that you're doing that. The body is a wonderful vehicle for allowing. The thing's already registering in our bodies, or it wouldn't get our attention that it feels bad. It feels negative, as we say. So the body's already saying, this is actually happening. And so my sense is if a person can just really relax into the physical sensation of it, not fight it, notice any tendency to drop it into a category of positive or negative, or any tendency to try to change it, then what happens, the delicious thing that can happen, if I really just allow myself to feel whatever's happening right now, sometimes that very gesture of unresisting, manipulating in any way, opens us to the larger space that's, as it were, holding the whole thing. It's the larger space is what we really are, and the thing and a person that can actually see all of this occurring while it's occurring. And sometimes in that very deep seeing, it will become apparent that this emotion at bottom was generated by a belief I have or an idea in my head. So it can be, this deep surrender can be very illuminating in that way, but it's important not to allow the negative or whatever emotion so that we can have an insight, or so that we can stop experiencing that thing. At some point, a person stops feeling what we call negative emotions. But until the stopping has happened, it's because there's something there for us to see. And the trick is to just allow the feeling without looking around in the weeds to see what is it this is trying to show me. Because it's the mind that's doing that.
The mind is asking that question, you mean? What is this trying to show me? Yeah.
Yeah. But if there is something to be revealed, awareness itself, which is not, I make a distinction between awareness and the mind, awareness itself will see that. It's like, oh. It's like a woman that I've been sharing with in this way for a long time said to me once that she'd had trouble sleeping. She had real chronic insomnia. And one night as she was lying there awake, she, just allowing herself to be awake, without going looking for it, she came upon this deep belief on which the insomnia had always been depending, which said, I should be able to sleep at night. And when she saw that, the next thing she knew, it was morning. She had fallen asleep. But that came all on its own. And she's an earnest seeker. She had, there's no stone she would have left unturned if she consciously could have gotten there. But I think the beginning of of real surrender to something difficult that's being felt in the body, the beginning of it is to notice that we're probably already resisting it. Or notice the unpleasantness of the sensation, or notice how the feeling is so tied up in thought somehow. And as soon as we become self-aware, then softening begins to happen. As long as we're not trying to change or stop anything.
It seems like the natural tendency is to do one of two things in my experience. If for example, there's a perceived slight against me, someone says something and I don't like what they say, I either will feel bad about it, it hurts me, or I will immediately attack the other person. One of those two things. And both of them are... both of those reactions are different, I think, than what you're describing, of just actually sitting and feeling that hurt, as opposed to thinking about the hurt or defending the hurt.
And sometimes the deep seeing and deep allowing occurs only afterward. And here the mind is a blessing, because the mind helps us, in effect, replay an episode of outer reactivity, which began with the inner reactivity that said, I don't like that, or but often the emotion is lingering still when we do that retrospect with the mind, and so it becomes possible if you look to see. Let's say you didn't react, but you just felt wounded. You didn't have the opportunity to lash out or something in you managed to monitor that. I have been someone historically who was very subject to having her feelings hurt, and didn't like being not thought well of and all that. And so if I looked deep, deep inside, let myself feel the bite that I had experienced or was experiencing right then. If I look to see, what is it? Where, is there something else besides the pain itself? It would have been, instead of people shouldn't act that way, which was my classic thing, or I'm a total loser. It would be a deep seeing that my sense of well-being in myself depends very heavily on what somebody thinks of me. That's where I get my sense of worth. And so then the attention goes from the other person who was an idiot or cruel or whatever I've been telling myself into my own sense of what makes a life, what makes my life, what makes me legitimate, okay, all that. And that's painful. Those very, the whole reason we have those mental structures is to protect ourselves from a very deep pain. And we don't want to go there. But to go there is a profound softening and inviting of illumination.
Richard Rose used to advocate that it would be helpful if you looked back upon some past experiences. In fact, I think he called that one of the first stages of meditation, or types of meditation, was to go back and look at some very confrontational experiences that you had or emotional experiences, and sort of replay those and see what was at the heart of them.
I think when we do that, and we begin to see how it really was about me, it wasn't about the other person.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
The ego doesn't like that at all. There's a huge but comes up on that one. But the more we begin to see that when somebody else has lashed out, we're seeing not only into ourselves and our own reaction and the wound that underlies our reaction, but we're seeing into the other person. And so we're realizing, and again, this is not mental, it's a deep heartfelt, body-felt thing, that everybody's wounded. And when somebody lashes out or is defensive or whatever they're doing, what's behind that in them is terrible pain. And that's how I experience people. I don't even notice that they're lashing out. I feel, oh my God, this person is hurting. But it's like, we recognize it in ourselves, and it causes the apparent distance between myself and other to soften. We really are all the same. We're not in a battle, or we don't have to be. And it's not about forgiving the other person. It's not about understanding how they got to be the way they are. Although, on the level of the mind, that can be useful. Eckhart Tolle once said something about, when you find yourself being put off by somebody's behavior, if you can just gently realize, well, if I had the same conditioning that person has, and I may not even know what their conditioning is, but I would be behaving the same way, doubtless. And, there is something to that. It's not about letting ourselves or anybody else off the hook. It's just seeing how a human being, because of the way our society is set up and child rearing and all that, is terribly subject to environment and forces and well-meaning and cruelty.
There's a quote I wanted to ask you about that's along this line. And you said there's a difference between indulging the thought and allowing yourself to feel what you're actually feeling. The key to this is to be in the body. And my question about that is, I'm thinking about myself in my 20s, for example. I would have had no idea of what you're talking about, be in the body. And I'm just curious if you can, if you run into people like that who just don't know what you're talking about, if you have any advice for how can one get more in tune with being in the body, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh, I surely do encounter people who, they either have no idea what I'm talking about, or they do know what I'm talking about, but only because they can feel themselves unable to be in the body.
No, I'm just agreeing.
Yeah. I could go a few different directions with this, but I'll just say briefly that for somebody who's experienced trauma, it's entirely possible that the body and the mind for such a person do not function in a truly automatic kind of way, in a way that consciousness has access to. And so when sometimes somebody will say, I really can't help it, and they literally can't. I'm not going to carry on about trauma, but I'm just going to say that I've learned enough about it. I'm certainly not an expert, but I've learned enough about it to get that for such a person, there is probably a necessary kind of healing or treatment or exploration on the psychological level that can happen, that can undo that pattern or soften it. But if that's not what's going on for somebody, and I don't think it usually is, who has no idea about the body, they can't attune to it, I would encourage such a person to be patient, first of all, to allow themselves to grow still in a moment when they're having a very painful emotion, and to just stop. What I mean is not try to stay busy, but to literally sit still or lie down and feel, just see if they can locate where the emotion in their body is occurring. If it's in their heart, are they sweaty? Do they have any physical expressions of it? Sometimes I might say, can you see with the emotion, can you see that there's mental activity that accompanies it? So sometimes I'll encourage them to go into their heads to explore as a way to help them get to the very deep pain that underlies the unpleasant emotion that has probably nothing to do with the emotion. So if they're able, even to say, am I telling myself a story? Like sometimes I'll encourage people, write down what you're telling yourself, the loop that's going on endlessly in your mind. And sometimes when they do that, or even just look to see what they're thinking, it will, I've already put it in their heads, see if there's something you believe in there that you might notice. So this is a very mental thing. Is there something here that says people shouldn't be this way, or I can't, there's a thing that I just can't do in my life that other people can. And then when they look to see, if they do come up, and this is a very slow process, it's something I would be supporting them through if I'm there, to see, is this thought perhaps protecting you from a very deep pain of loss or wound that you just don't want to feel? And then sometimes then the crying starts, or that will help them become aware of their bodies. I ask these people sometimes, do you ever cry? If they're not used to being physical, if they're not athletes or doing a physical labor of some kind, I will encourage them to do something, dance, take on a physical hobby or discipline or something that will help them become attuned to their physicality on that level. That's not specifically to do with an emotion. They may notice, oh, when I'm jogging, I feel really good, or I'm pushing myself, it feels bad, or, so sometimes encouraging a person to be more physical will gently, over time, help them be more attuned to the registering of an emotion in the body. But I think the main thing is encouraging them to notice how much they're in their heads without trying to change it, just see it.
Yeah.
That they take refuge in their minds. Sometimes it's just when you eat a meal. Notice when the food tastes really good, notice the sensation of fullness in your belly. Things that a lot of people they're not conscious of. So sometimes that's a doorway to becoming more aware of a physicality.
I was curious if I've heard you mention the words attention, consciousness, and awareness almost interchangeably, and I was curious if that's true, or if you differentiate between those three terms.
I think I use them more or less interchangeably, and I know different people use one of those words a different way. One thing I'd say about it is consciousness. What I think of as consciousness, it can be aware of just itself. I'm using aware there. Hard to use language, but I think attention, it's useful to notice what goes on in terms of a person's attention alongside thinking, which is different. But the way that we tend to learn about that and notice it is by seeing that we're attending something. Our attention is on something in the outer world, or sometimes on the interior, but the more obvious way is having to do with the immediate environment, something sensory or in motion. So we can notice attention to something out there. So it feels like attention has an object. As I experience and sometimes use the word consciousness, it could be used interchangeably, but it can also feel itself. It's like a container sensing itself. There doesn't have to be something in it, or that it's something that it's on. For one thing, in that way that I'm using consciousness, there's a diffuse quality that's, let's say, softly attuned to anything in the field of consciousness. It's not focused the way attention often is. So sometimes if I'm in a deep conversation with someone and I'm directing my attention to the look on their face, the words they're saying, the words I'm saying, I will lose all track of the hunger in my belly or the pain in my foot. Consciousness, what I think of as consciousness, is softer, and it's not directed in a certain direction necessarily. It's more soft kind of attunement or alertness. But I'm making a distinction here, only that I think can be useful to somebody when they're trying to notice what does attention feel like. It's easier when it's on something.
Does the idea of you mentioned being aware of consciousness? I think that's how you phrased it. Does your mind, or does your experience, or did you have the experience of being, what am I searching for here? There's a paradox there of how can consciousness be aware of itself? How can a thing know of itself? I bring this up because in meditation for years, I was hung up on, there's this awareness, but now I'm aware of this awareness. And it seemed like there were two awarenesses inside of me, and they were always flipping back and forth from one to the other, and I could never feel like I am that awareness, because it was always this shifting thing. Does that ring any bells with you?
Can you say a little bit more about what the first one, what you described as the initial consciousness there?
Yeah, okay.
What would it be conscious
let's say
of?
in a typical meditation practice, like a Vipassana practice where you're being aware of your breathing, let's say, or you're noting things, a thought comes up and you literally note it of, anger, happiness, these different things come up, and you note them and move on. At some point that quiets down, and there's just like a space in which things appear, and I would call that awareness. But then there'll be a moment of resting in that awareness, and then suddenly there's the sense of being aware of resting in that awareness. And that always befuddled me, is how could I, if what we are is awareness, for example, and it's a concept, but in experiencing that, it always seemed like there would inevitably be some other awareness of that, some other observer of this process.
My sense of what goes on is that in the first thing that you described, if you're sitting and you notice a thought or breathing, sound in the room, as soon as let's just say interior things, not sound in the room, but as soon as you notice, as soon as awareness or consciousness notices something that's going on in the mind, then it stops, and so usually, and so then, absent anything to focus on or to give attention to, the awareness then has the leisure, the luxury to notice itself. That's my sense of what happens. And so but really, it could say, if we are spaciousness, the thing that's going on the whole time is that even when you notice that there's a negative thought, the thing that's doing the noticing is not experiencing the negativity, right? It's seeing it. And so there's evidence there. There's, if you have eyes to see it, there's evidence. The important thing that's going on there is not it's not the seeing of the negativity. It's certainly not the negativity. It's the fact that there's something in my conscious awareness that can see that isn't subject to the thing it's seeing. And as soon as that happens, the predominant reality or the restfulness of that seer you could say just wants to be with itself. But as soon as, if a person, if the mind turns on at all, then, that we retreat from that. The premise of all of it is what is it in me that's doing this? And I think what happens when consciousness is just sensing itself is that the sense of any self has disappeared fleetingly, usually. And in fact, I think people sometimes have moments like that they don't retain, they don't remember later happen because their minds were so not in the picture then. But I also think it's possible, and I've seen this happen, to be, for the awareness to be aware of itself without that being a trigger for the mind to get busy. Mm-hmm. And that can be retained later. The mind can remember. Mm-hmm. I don't know how that happens, but I've seen it many times. So it's like something we were talking about a while ago. To me, the useful thing to do when, say, sitting in meditation or whatever, when awareness notices negativity, the useful thing to do there, to be aware of, is ask the question, what is it that's aware of the negativity? Not where does the negativity come from or what can I do about it, but what actual function in me is able to see? Where is it located? Some people have a sense of it actually being outside or bigger than or something. Have you read Sam Harris's book where he talks about consciousness?
Doing nothing? Is that it? Or something along that line? Oh, no. Yeah, you're talking about the guy who likes to debate.
Yeah, that's what he's known
Sam
for.
Harris, PhD.
This one is called Waking Up, Spirituality Without Religion, or something like that. He really looks in a rigorously scientific way, to the extent that's possible. He really looks at the nature of consciousness and asks that very question that you asked: how is it that consciousness can recognize itself? And his exploration of that, and he's also a meditator, which nobody ever would have known until he came out in this book, given his reputation for being an atheist and all the rest of it. He basically says so far at this point in the scientific exploration of how the mind functions, we cannot answer that question, how consciousness can recognize itself. But he makes very compelling, ordinary, day-to-day, you could say non-spiritual observations about how a person can notice in him or herself what's actually already going on there that's part of our own innate equipment. And I found that book. I don't read anymore. I'm not interested in reading. But that one hooked me.
Yeah, I'll make sure to link to that in the notes from the show so people can look that book up.
And I'm not making anything on Sam Harris's book sales. I've mentioned this book enough times at retreats and stuff that I sometimes think people may think, is she like friends with him or trying to help him? He doesn't need any help from anybody selling books. But anyway, if that sort of thing speaks to a person, it's, I think, very compelling. So I don't know. It's a marvel to me. I feel very fortunate to be a human being that it can experience consciousness sensing itself. It's delicious.
Do you find that people wind up wanting to chase a state of where they feel like they are more aware more of the time, and that itself becomes another goal? I'm trying to see what are some of the blocks, if you will, or side routes that people in your experience go down.
It certainly is something that sometimes people can do, but what I notice happening is, even if that happens for a while, if they become sort of addicted to that feeling of it, let's say, because it rescues them from the pain of life or something.
Exactly.
Even if that, you could say, is a motivator for a while, what happens, and this is so lovely and humbling to witness. The more a person actually experiences being in the present, and actually experiences that the present, however unpleasant it may be, it really is all that's real, the more they tend to fall out of love with accumulating experience, or making a certain kind of experience more predominant, or achieving something, or waking up. And I think it's because time, and anything that could happen in time, has ceased to feel tangible to them. So, ironically, some of the people who have been the most devoted, earnest seekers stop being seekers, not because they necessarily woke up, but because they forget to pay attention to much of anything else besides what's happening right now. And they've, little by little, learned that it hurts to resist. And so they've come to rest in what's happening instead of trying to change it, including trying to change themselves and their own experience. So sometimes they'll lament to me, they'll say, I've lost interest in waking up, and I just laugh. What more wonderful thing could happen? Mm-hmm. So even if somebody's trying really hard to have that experience more often, it's probably not going to continue. Anyway, we can't make those moments happen. We can't make ourselves not be reactive, for instance. All we can do is see when we are reactive. We can see that we are in resistance. We are in our heads. We have been, the last however long. And as soon as you see that, it often softens. And yes, it feels good. And I encourage people to pay attention to how it feels. Yes, it feels lovely. And don't let the next thing be, how can I make this happen more?
I think that's at least a tendency that I see with teachings that point out, let's say, that, hey, there's this awareness, and it's here, and it's always here, and people get a sense of that, say, during a lecture or from reading a book, and then the immediate reaction is, oh, I felt it, and now I don't feel it, and now I want it again.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to go back to a lecture, go to more lectures, and sit in more satsangs, and so I can feel it more and more and more until I feel it all the time, or almost all the time.
Yeah, it doesn't work. If instead such a person could make note of the wish to make it happen more, and explore, what is it in me that wants that? It's the same machinery that suffers. And it doesn't want to suffer. It wants to feel good. But we don't put our attention in the right place. The tendency is to follow that desire and think, how can I get it? I should go back to that teacher, whatever.
Absolutely.
And instead, if I were such a person and had that thought, that driving desire, if I could just pause for a second and say, what am I really? Which is what this whole thing is about. What am I really? What is it in me that wants that? Until something leads us to look at that, we're just going to stay on the same loop. And we might have peaceful moments of great insight, but we didn't cause them when they happened. We just didn't. Or if we did, it was in spite of our... Maybe we can look back and say it was something I did that brought that about. It was that that's what terrible suffering sometimes brings about in people. You can look back and say, wow, if my house hadn't burned down, my whole sense of myself might not have changed. We can see it in retrospect, and that, there are a lot of obviously famous waking up stories that were apparently precipitated by some devastation.
Along that line, perhaps, there are a number of teachers who talk about the importance of earnestness and devoting attention, applying energy, and determination, and these sorts of very perhaps masculine qualities of really going after something. Do you see a place for that? Do you feel like that those qualities tend to get in the way of what's there?
Oh, I think it depends on how that thing expresses itself in a person's experience and sense of themselves. If it feels like being a taskmaster, that's one thing. Mm-hmm. It's not something we can cause in ourselves to be devoted or to be earnest. It's something we either naturally, we can't help but move towards something. Right. But to encourage somebody to cultivate that kind of quality or trait, if it isn't naturally there, it probably isn't going to get them anywhere. But it can be fruitful to see if there's resistance and avoidance. It looks to me like, in order for us to, you could say, benefit from life experience as it bangs into us all the time, our willingness, and Richard Rose talked about this, our willingness to, as it were, sacrifice or suffer anything without condition, if there is such a willingness, the chances are greater that our life experience will bear fruit. If there isn't a willingness, if we have conditions, and I remember very clearly having some of my own conditions, then that will surely interfere with the ability of life to teach us. So to me, the useful thing is to look and see, do I have a devotion? Do I have an energy, a willingness to sacrifice everything? Or do I have a list of things that I'm not willing to sacrifice? To observe that these things are functioning can bear fruit, but to say, I'm going to get rid of the list, that's not how it happens. But as soon as we become aware that there are conditions or tendencies we have that keep us from absolutely surrendering to life, then that can be fruitful. But that's really different from saying, I'm going to be vigilant, I'm going to try really, really hard to not have negative thoughts, or, it's so exhausting. I feel so bad for people that do that and don't get anywhere, and they're tired from it and so discouraged. It's just because it doesn't work. It's the mind. So some people are naturally given to what you were describing.
Certainly, to use an example from everyday life, if you have a desire to start your own business, for example, and that's been there a long time, there can be a lot of fears that will prevent you from doing that, even though that desire is there. You're not letting it come to the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a wonderful analogy, really, because when I said we can trust ourselves very deeply, it seems to me that a person can be aware, let's say, that the desire to start a business is there, be aware that fear has been stopping me, and then a frustration or a feeling of lack of fulfillment. If somebody's willing to see I'm afraid and to deeply go into the feeling of that longing to start a business and realize that until I respond to that, the business isn't going to happen and I'm just going to be frustrated. And maybe the business won't happen anyway, but so to deeply trust the thing that's seen as a longing is it's a recipe for feeling more alive, whether or not it's a recipe for a successful business. But the thing is either there or it's not, right? You can't make somebody this, You could talk somebody into thinking they ought to really want to start a business, but it's false.
Yeah, that's a great point.
It seems to me that the deeper we can see into ourselves, into what's fundamentally motivating us, the underlying desire or fear or whatever it is, that's when light begins to come on. But as long as we're operating even behaviorally, in terms of, what do I do for a living, or who do I spend time with, or so if we're operating at any kind of a distance from that deep, deep motivation, nothing really important is going to happen spiritually or otherwise. We're just going to keep feeling like we're not really living.
And do you think that if a person were to come to you and say, I'm feeling stuck, I just don't know what to do next, do you think that people are ever really just don't know what to do, or there's something else going on there?
Usually it doesn't take very much for me to see why they're stuck. And it can be different for different people. First of all, I think it's good to see that you're stuck. That's useful. Often it reveals, if you turn and look at it, the stuckness, you'll be able to see there are beliefs underlying that said, this kind of thing should bear fruit and it's not. Or you may find that there are places you just don't want to go. There are feelings you just don't want to feel. So stuckness is useful because it points to something if you have eyes to see. So if it only leads a person to saying, I'm just going to give up on the things I've been trying because they're not working, well, that's really useful. Sometimes it's just out of frustration, but it can be a door opening. There's something else needs to happen. And so, but I'm not going to give them another method for sure. I'm going to help them look within and see what does the stuckness reveal about a place in themselves they haven't wanted to go, most likely, or refuge that they've been taking in a set of beliefs that's just mental garbage. Lots of people start off their conversations with me with, I feel stuck. I've been doing this for a long, long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's great. It's a great day to recognize one's stuckness. Something is tired of being stuck and willing to take a risk or question something that's not been questioned.
A couple of short questions for you. You mentioned Sam Harris's book, Waking Up. Are there any other books that you tend to recommend to people?
It's hard for me to... That one came to me because it was more recently in my awareness, but not later on. Something might come to me and I'll email you, but
sure,
not right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how about one of the things I love is film. Are there any films that you feel like capture some of the sense of the spiritual search or spiritual awakening?
Wow. I love movies too. It's an interesting thing. What comes to me without an actual title coming to me is that, and I think these would often be foreign made, I must say, not necessarily, but watching a movie that a person feels very still while watching. It's not explicitly about things spiritual, but maybe there's a lot of the natural world in it. It's moving very slowly. Any kind of meaning is very much between the lines. It's not heavily caught up in a human dynamic. I mean, I don't know what movie am I talking about, but let's just say I know I've had that experience sometimes watching movies.
Yeah, there's a Japanese film, I believe, it's something like summer, fall, winter, spring, something like that, and it's set in a monastery, I think, and it's very quiet. A lot of scenes of the natural world, but there is a story there as well. Yeah,
I think I remember seeing that, and I can't say, I don't remember it well enough to say if it did had that kind of effect for me, but I think that is the kind of thing I'm thinking of. You know, even though I still love to watch movies, when I watch them, my mind, I don't follow plot line. I don't pay a whole lot of attention to the specific things being said in dialogue. So which is a way of saying, I think most movies really do engage us on the mental level.
Oh yeah.
And I don't want to do that. So,
in terms of your relationship with people these days, is that something that's I'm assuming that's something that's radically changed since this experience of fear falling away?
Oh yeah, some relationships that I had went away, just kind of naturally. The ones that endured surely changed, but this was many years ago by now, and what I find now is that I really enjoy being around people, observing and feeling them and so on, but I don't feel the need really for relationships per se. Although there are some I do have that I enjoy very much, but only probably actually spending time with such a person only very occasionally. There's something about being with another person in a way where there's actual engagement going on that requires us to be people. Each of us to be a person in some way. And I really love what happens when that's not being asked. And that's how I account for it after the fact, my great preference for solitude. But my children, for instance, I have a wonderful relationship with each of my children, and I'm only glad of the time I spend with each of them. So it's not like I'm incapable of relating in the good old-fashioned way. But surely the relationship with each of them has changed because of what happened to their mother.
Now I noticed in the Bat Gap interview that you did that you have a cat. I saw a cat sneaking around in the background. We have 2 cats.
Oh.
Do you feel like, do you have any sense of the awareness or consciousness of cat and what that is like?
I'm sitting here near one of my cats right now. I love the company of animals in general, and my sense of, I remember Eckhart saying he's had a couple of great meditation masters who were cats.
Yeah.
My sense of animals is that the pleasure that I experience, and I think many of us experience in their presence, comes with the fact that they're just alive. They're absolutely in the immediacy. They process only to the extent that processing is necessary to stay out of danger and rest and get themselves fed. And I think when we're in the presence of that in us that's like that too, recognizes itself, you could say. So I think part of what we appreciate about their company is we get to feel ourselves with them, and I don't think most of us are conscious of that, and I can't even say that I know that's true. But I have, do I have any idea what it's like inside my cat's consciousness? Oh, how I wish I did. But it amuses me to think I do. We have conversations and so on, but I know fundamentally I'm a human being and he's a cat.
Yeah. I was just curious. I'm fascinated by them myself, and just sort of sitting quietly next to them is, it's an interesting experience. If we're about out of time, if people want to find out more about you or get in touch with you, how would they go about doing that?
Well, I have a website, which is janfrazierteachings.com. I think it's .com. And there are places on the website that would lead to books and events, if there are events. right now I'm not planning events, but and if someone wants to get in touch to have a private session, it says there how to do that. And if they're just interested in books, certainly they're on Amazon and whatever the other places might be.
Great. And you have, how many books do you have now? It's 4 or 5 books now?
Let's see. 2 books came out in hard form, solid form. They're also as ebooks. And then two others are just in ebook form. I think it's 2. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
I'll make sure that I link to all those in the show notes as well. Well, I don't have any more questions. Is there anything that you want to wrap up with?
I almost said no, but something quick does come to me, which is to say that if a person senses that there's more to themselves than their minds and their suffering, I really encourage them to trust that deep knowing, and just to sit with that knowing, without necessarily saying, well, now what do I do about it? But they're tuning into something real and actual and precious. So precious.
Thank you. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you, Sean. It's been delightful.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate it.